If you are Japanese or Korean, everything you were taught about where you come from is only half true. Not wrong, half. And the missing half was buried in bones nobody thought to test until now. For most of the 20th century, the story was simple, and it was told with confidence in classrooms and museum placards and national identity itself. The Japanese people descended from two ancestors. First came the Jōmon, hunter-gatherers who fished the coasts and forests of the archipelago for thousands of years, isolated, untouched, a people shaped entirely by their islands. Then, around 2,300 years ago, came the Yayoi, farmers who arrived from the mainland carrying rice, bronze, and a new way of living. Two peoples, one blending, one nation born from a single moment of fusion. It was clean, it was teachable, and for decades, nobody had the tools to check if it was actually true. Korea's story was simpler still, in the sense that it was barely told at all. Ancient human remains on the peninsula are rare. The soil, the climate, centuries of war and upheaval, all of it conspired against preservation. So the genetic history of Korea was mostly inferred backward from living people, from modern blood samples, from assumptions stitched together without a single ancient voice to confirm or deny them. Koreans were, in the popular imagination, a single continuous bloodline stretching back into the mists of the peninsula's earliest days. Stable, unbroken, untouched by the tides that reshaped everyone else. Both stories were comforting, both were incomplete, and both started to come apart the moment scientists learned how to read DNA out of bones that were thousands of years old. This is not a story about war or invasion or conquest in the way we usually picture it. Nobody stormed a beach. No army marched over a mountain pass and planted a flag. What happened instead was slower and, in some ways, stranger. It was migration in waves, spaced out over centuries, sometimes over 1,000 years apart. Each wave leaving a genetic fingerprint so faint that it took whole genome sequencing technology, developed only in the last 15 years, to even detect it. The people of Japan and Korea were not built in a single moment. They were built in layers like sediment, one population settling on top of another and then another, until the surface looked uniform even though the depths told a completely different story. The first crack in the old two-ancestor model appeared in 2021, in a study published in the journal Science Advances. A team led by researchers at Trinity College Dublin, working with Japanese archaeologists, did something nobody had done before at this scale. They extracted and sequenced 12 ancient genomes from skeletons spanning 8,000 years of Japanese prehistory. Not modern DNA reconstructed backward. Actual ancient DNA, pulled directly from bone, dated, verified, and compared. What they found broke the two-ancestor model completely. Yes, there was Jōmon ancestry. Yes, there was a wave of migration during the Yayoi period that brought rice farming. But there was also a third population, arriving centuries later during what's called the Kofun period, roughly around the year 300 AD. This third wave did not simply add a small genetic footnote. It dominated. Researchers estimated that modern Japanese people carry only about 13% Jōmon ancestry and about 16% from that early Yayoi wave. The remaining 71%, the overwhelming majority of the modern Japanese genome, came from this later, previously invisible migration. An entire population arriving in force, its genetic legacy hiding in plain sight for over 1,000 years because nobody had thought to look for it. Geneticist Shigeki Nakagome, who co-led the study, called it a rewriting of the origins of modern Japan. Not an adjustment, a rewriting. Because if 71% of the modern population's ancestry comes from a source that wasn't even part of the story until this study, then the entire national narrative, the founding myth of two peoples meeting and merging, was, at best, a rough sketch of something far more complicated. And that third wave had a face. It didn't come from nowhere. When researchers looked closely at its genetic signature, it resembled the Han Chinese population that dominates modern China, suggesting the Kofun period migrants carried ancestry from continental East Asia, arriving at a moment in history that lines up almost perfectly with the emergence of centralized political power in Japan, the beginning of organized states, the beginning of what would eventually become the imperial system. The people who reshaped the Japanese gene pool arrived at the exact same time Japan started to look, politically, like a unified nation. That is not a coincidence historians can easily wave away. But the story doesn't stop there, because a second and even more specific piece of evidence surfaced only a couple of years later, and this time it came from a single skeleton. In 1952, construction workers in Yamaguchi Prefecture, at a site called Doigahama, uncovered the remains of over 300 people from the Yayoi period. For 70 years, those bones sat in collections, studied by archaeologists for their shapes, their burial patterns, their tools, but never fully unlocked at the genetic level because the technology to sequence a complete, high-quality ancient genome from degraded material simply didn't exist yet. Then, in 2024, a team from the University of Tokyo finally did it. They sequenced the full nuclear genome of one individual from that site, a person who had been in the ground for roughly 2,300 years, and they compared that genome against both ancient and modern populations across East Asia. The result was almost unnervingly precise. Among all the non-Japanese populations tested, this Yayoi period individual's closest genetic relatives were not scattered across the Chinese mainland, not spread thinly across Siberia. They were concentrated specifically in the Korean Peninsula. The lead researcher on the project, Jōmon, put it plainly, between the Yayoi period and the Kofun period, the majority of immigrants who reshaped the Japanese archipelago's population came primarily from Korea, not from some diffuse, generalized East Asian migration, from Korea specifically. This mattered for another reason too. It directly contradicted a competing theory that had been gaining traction, the idea that Japan's ancestry formed through two entirely separate migratory pulses from two different regions, one Northeast Asian group arriving during Yayoi and a completely different East Asian group arriving during Kofun. Ohashi's team found that model didn't hold up. Instead, the evidence pointed toward a single, continuous corridor of migration across the Korea Strait, spanning centuries, funneling people from the peninsula into the archipelago again and again, wave after wave, until the genetic character of an entire nation had shifted beneath the feet of the people living there. Older genetic work using slower and cruder tools than whole genome sequencing had actually been circling the same conclusion for decades without ever being able to prove it outright. Back in the 1990s, researchers studying Y chromosome markers, the genetic material passed almost unchanged from father to son, noticed something they couldn't fully explain at the time: a distinct Korean and Tibetan signature woven into the paternal lineages of modern Japanese men. Around the same period, separate studies of mitochondrial DNA, the maternal counterpart, kept turning up the same pattern from the other side of the family tree. Korean input, again and again, showing up in data sets that were technically too limited to reconstruct a full population history, but were more than capable of hinting that something significant had happened. For 30 years, this evidence sat there, suggestive but unconfirmed, waiting for a technology capable of actually resolving it. The whole genome studies of the 2020s didn't invent this connection. They finally proved what smaller, quieter studies had been suggesting since before most people currently reading about this were even born. Here is where the story becomes genuinely strange. Because if the ancestors of modern Japanese people were arriving from Korea in such overwhelming numbers, then logic demands a question nobody had properly answered. What did those ancient Koreans actually look like? Genetically? Were they the same as modern Koreans? Was there a stable, continuous Korean population sitting on the peninsula, sending out wave after wave of migrants to Japan while remaining essentially unchanged itself? The answer, once scientists finally got their hands on ancient Korean remains, was no, not even close. Ancient DNA from Korea is rare, which is precisely why the discoveries that do exist carry so much weight. One of the most significant came from individuals dated to Korea's Three Kingdoms period, roughly the 4th and 5th centuries AD. The same broad window as Japan's Kofun period transformation. When researchers sequenced genomes from this era, they found something that should not have been there if the standard assumption about Korean continuity were true. These ancient individuals carried a variable, sometimes substantial proportion of Jōmon-related ancestry, the genetic signature associated primarily with Japan's indigenous hunter-gatherers. That ancestry does not survive in modern Koreans. It was there in the 4th century. It is gone now. Think about what that actually means. The genetic marker most closely tied to prehistoric Japan was present at meaningful levels in people living on the Korean Peninsula 1,500 years ago. And at some point between then and now, it was diluted, absorbed, and effectively erased from the Korean gene pool, the same way it was diluted in Japan by later migrations. The two populations weren't just exchanging people in one direction. They were tangled together, sharing ancestral threads that neither modern national identity fully accounts for. A related discovery emerged from the Gaya region of Korea, a confederation of small states that existed during roughly the same Three Kingdoms era, known historically for its advanced ironworking and its complex trade relationships with both Korea's other kingdoms and with Japan across the strait. When researchers analyzed ancient genomes from individuals buried in Gaya territory, they found a population defined by real diversity, some individuals carrying signatures closer to Northern Asian populations, others carrying that same Jōmon-related ancestry, all coexisting within a single regional population at the same point in time. This wasn't a homogeneous ethnic group with occasional outliers. It was a genuinely mixed society, and the mixture included genetic threads pulling directly toward the same populations that were, at that very moment, reshaping the human landscape of Japan. One detail from this research stands out because of how directly it ties the two populations together. The most common mitochondrial DNA haplogroup found among these ancient Korean individuals, a genetic marker passed down maternally, relatively unchanged generation after generation, is a lineage called D4. This same haplogroup shows up as one of the most common maternal lineages among Yayoi period farmers in Japan, and it is almost completely absent from the Jōmon population that Yayoi farmers were mixing with when they arrived on the islands. In other words, the maternal ancestry connecting ancient Koreans to ancient Japanese farmers is not a loose general resemblance. It's a specific, traceable genetic thread, present on one side of the strait and carried directly across to the other. There's also a broader genomic study worth mentioning here, one that stepped back from any single ancient period, and instead tried to trace the entire arc of Korean population history from the earliest human presence on the peninsula up through today. Researchers compared 88 modern Korean genomes against 91 other present-day populations worldwide, then layered in comparisons against 115 ancient genomes spanning everything from Pleistocene-era hunter-gatherers to Iron Age farmers. What emerged was a picture of gradual, repeated admixture stretching back tens of thousands of years, a slow blending of ancestry connected to an ancient individual known as Tian Yuan Man, dated to roughly 40,000 years ago, and a separate ancestral population associated with a site called Devil's Gate Cave, dated to around 8,000 years ago. These two deep ancestral threads wove through East Asia and East Siberia continuously into the Neolithic period, well before anything resembling a distinct Korean or Japanese identity had formed. In other words, even the deepest layers of Korean ancestry weren't static. They were themselves the product of earlier waves of mixing, going back to a period so distant that neither modern nation, nor the peninsula and archipelago as culturally distinct places, had even come into existence yet. So by this point, the picture forming is not one of two separate nations with two separate stable identities, occasionally brushing up against each other through trade or diplomacy. It's a picture of one interconnected zone of human movement, stretching from the Korean Peninsula across the strait into the Japanese archipelago, with people, genes, farming techniques, and eventually political structures flowing back and forth across that water for well over 1,000 years. The border between Korean and Japanese, at least in the genetic sense, simply did not exist in any fixed way during the period when both modern populations were actually forming. And if that were the full extent of the story, it would already be enough to overturn a century of assumptions. But the most recent research, published only months ago, suggests the truth is even more fractured than that. In May of 2026, a team based at the Riken Center for Integrative Medical Sciences in Yokohama, led by researcher Xiaoxi Liu, published the largest whole genome study of living Japanese people ever conducted. They sequenced the complete genomes of 3,256 individuals, drawn from 7 distinct geographic regions across Japan, including the main islands and the Okinawan archipelago in the south. This was not ancient DNA pulled from bone. This was modern, living genetic material, but analyzed with a level of resolution nobody had previously applied to the question of Japanese ancestry. Earlier studies, including the landmark 2021 tripartite research, had focused on broad, ancient contributions. The big three waves: Jōmon, Yayoi, Kofun. This new study asked a different question. It looked specifically at rare genetic variants, the kind of subtle mutations that tend to reflect more recent population history rather than deep ancestral events from thousands of years ago. And what it found was that even within the supposedly unified modern Japanese population, there were at least 3 distinguishable ancestral components still visible today in living people across different regions of the country. One component was strongest in Okinawa, in the far south, an area long known to carry a distinct genetic character shaped by its geographic isolation and its unique history as the former Ryukyu Kingdom. A second component was strongest in the northeastern regions of Japan, and a third was strongest in the west. Here is where the story circles back and closes a loop that had been open since 2021. The Western Japanese population showed its closest genetic ties to Han Chinese populations, consistent with that dominant Kofun-era migration identified years earlier. But the northeastern Japanese population showed something different. It was more closely related to ancient Korean populations, specifically from the Three Kingdoms period, and remarkably, also carried a stronger connection back to the original Jōmon population than the rest of the country. In other words, Japan is not one genetic story. It's at least 3, layered geographically as well as historically, with the Northeast carrying more of the Old World, more Jōmon, more of that ancient Korean connection, while the West carries more of the newer Han-related migration that arrived with Kofun-era state formation. The researcher who led the study summarized it in a single blunt sentence. The Japanese population isn't as genetically homogeneous as everyone thinks. That sentence deserves to sit for a moment because it's not a minor scientific footnote. Japan has, for most of its modern history, been culturally understood, both by outsiders and by many Japanese people themselves, as one of the most ethnically uniform nations on Earth. A single people, a single language, a single unbroken cultural line. That idea has shaped immigration policy, national identity, education, even foreign perception of the country for generations. And now, a genome-scale study involving over 3,000 living people is quietly demonstrating that the uniformity was never as complete as assumed. The regional differences aren't cosmetic. They're written into the DNA, and they trace directly back to which ancient migratory wave settled most heavily in which part of the country, and how much that wave mixed with the populations already living there. Sense when you see it as one continuous step back now and look at the whole shape of this story, because it only really makes us process rather than a series of disconnected discoveries. Roughly 40,000 years ago, the earliest human populations were already moving through Northeast Asia, carrying ancestry that would eventually feed into both the Korean Peninsula and the Japanese archipelago. By around 15,000 years ago, the Jōmon culture had taken root in Japan, developing in relative isolation for over 10,000 years. Genuinely one of the longest continuous hunter-gatherer traditions anywhere on the planet. Then, starting around the 9th century BC, farmers began arriving from the continent, most heavily from the Korean Peninsula, bringing rice cultivation and beginning the Yayoi period, mixing with the existing Jōmon population, but not erasing it. Then, on the Korean side, roughly contemporaneous complexity was unfolding that nobody had documented until ancient genomes from the Three Kingdoms and Gaia periods were finally sequenced. A peninsula that was itself a patchwork of populations with varying levels of Jōmon-related ancestry, Northern Asian ancestry, and everything in between. Not the stable monolith it's often assumed to have been. Then, around the year 300 AD, the third and largest wave hit Japan, the Kofun migration, heavily Han-related in character, arriving alongside the birth of centralized political authority, ultimately contributing this majority of the genetic material carried by people living in Japan today. This wave appears to have moved less evenly across the country, settling more heavily in the west, leaving the northeast with a genetic profile that still, to this day, leans more heavily toward the older Jōmon and Korean-linked ancestry. And through all of this, the maternal and paternal lineages moving between the Korean Peninsula and the Japanese islands, that D4 mitochondrial haplogroup, the Y chromosome markers researchers have traced showing clear historical influence flowing in both directions, tell us that this wasn't simply migration in one direction from one fixed population to another. It was centuries of contact, intermarriage, and shared ancestry across a body of water that modern maps treat as a hard national boundary, but that ancient genomes treat as barely a boundary at all. So what does this actually mean for the millions of people alive today who identify as Korean or Japanese, who were raised with a specific story about where their ancestors came from and who their people have always been? It means the story was never false in the sense of being invented. The Jōmon were real. The Yayoi migration was real. Korean farmers really did cross the strait and reshape the islands. But the story was radically incomplete because it left out an entire migratory wave that turned out to be the single largest genetic contributor to the modern population. And it left out the fact that the ancient Korean population sending those migrants was itself far more genetically diverse and far less continuous than anyone assumed. The idea of a single, pure, unbroken lineage for either nation simply does not survive contact with the actual evidence sitting in the bones. It's worth pointing out, too, that this pattern isn't unique to East Asia, which is part of why geneticists find it so unsurprising even as the public reaction tends to be shock. The exact same kind of story is played out with ancient DNA studies of the British Isles, where the Beaker people were shown to have replaced the bulk of the earlier Neolithic population's ancestry within a few centuries. It played out in India, where researchers found that the population is a blend of ancestral North Indian and ancestral South Indian components that mixed far more recently than anyone had assumed, with that mixing then actively suppressed by social structures that discouraged further intermarriage. It played out across Europe more broadly, where the introduction of ancient DNA sequencing revealed that the indigenous populations of nearly every modern nation are themselves descendants of at least 2 or 3 major replacement and mixing events, not a single unbroken line stretching back to the last ice age. Korea and Japan are not an exception to some rule of human stability. They are simply the latest and one of the more thoroughly documented examples of a rule that appears to apply to almost every human population that has ever been properly tested. Identity feels ancient and fixed from the inside. It turns out to be recent and layered the moment you look at the actual genetic record. It also means something quieter and in some ways more unsettling about how identity gets built in the first place. For most of human history, people constructed their sense of who they were using the tools available to them: language, culture, geography, political borders, oral tradition. Genetics wasn't part of the equation because nobody could see it. Entire national identities, the idea of what it means to be Japanese, the idea of what it means to be Korean, were built and reinforced for centuries without a single person actually knowing, at the molecular level, what their ancestry contained. And now that the molecular level is finally visible, it's revealing patterns nobody designed and nobody predicted. Regional splits within supposedly unified nations, ancient populations that vanished without a trace in the historical record, and a level of interconnection between two countries that modern politics often prefers to downplay. There's also a scientific lesson buried in here, separate from the national identity questions, and it's worth sitting with because it applies far beyond Korea and Japan. For decades, population history was inferred almost entirely from modern DNA, reasoning backward from living people to guess what their ancestors must have looked like genetically. That approach works to a point, but it has a fundamental blind spot. If a population existed, contributed genetically to later generations, and then was diluted or absorbed to the point of near invisibility, modern DNA alone often can't detect that it was ever there. The only way to catch a population like that is to go back and test the actual ancient remains directly, which is exactly why the discovery of that Jōmon-related ancestry in Three Kingdoms-era Koreans was so significant. It doesn't exist in modern Koreans at meaningful levels. Without ancient DNA, it would have stayed invisible forever, and an entire chapter of the shared history between these two peoples would have simply never been recovered. Researchers involved in this work have been careful, consistently, to frame these findings not as some kind of scandal or embarrassing secret, but as exactly what population genetics predicts should be normal. Humans move. Humans have always moved in waves over centuries, mixing with whoever they encounter, leaving genetic traces that outlast the political and cultural memory of the movement itself. The surprise isn't that Japan and Korea turned out to have complicated, layered, interconnected origins. The surprise is only that it took this long, and this much technology to actually prove it, because for most of human history, the tools to check simply didn't exist, and the assumption of stability filled the gap left by that missing evidence. There's one more piece worth sitting with before we close this out, and it concerns Okinawa specifically, because the far south of Japan tells its own separate version of this same story. Genomic work on the Ryukyu Islands has pointed toward a tripartite ancestry of its own, distinct from the mainland pattern, with its own layered history of Jōmon-related populations. Later, agricultural migrants and centuries of contact with both mainland Japan and the wider maritime trade networks of East Asia. Okinawa was, for much of its history, an independent kingdom before it was ever politically absorbed into Japan, and its genome still remembers that independence in ways its modern political status doesn't reflect. It's a reminder that Japan was never one migration story unfolding uniformly across a single landmass. It was several overlapping stories, happening at different speeds in different regions, that only later got flattened into a single national narrative for the sake of simplicity. What comes next, according to the researchers themselves, is more of the same detailed work, not a single final answer. The team behind the Doigahama skeleton study has already said their next goal is sequencing more Yayoi period individuals, hoping to pin down exactly how the admixture between continental migrants and indigenous Jōmon people actually progressed, region by region, generation by generation. The Riken team behind the 2026 whole genome study is continuing to expand their dataset, looking for even finer-grained regional signatures that might reveal still more hidden structure inside a population once assumed to be uniform. And on the Korean side, every new ancient skeleton that gets successfully sequenced has, so far, added complexity rather than confirming the old assumption of continuity, which strongly suggests there is more still buried, literally and figuratively, waiting to be found. So if you are Japanese or Korean or simply someone who has always assumed that national identity and genetic ancestry line up neatly with the borders on a modern map, the current science offers a quiet but firm correction. The people of these two nations were not built by a single founding population multiplying in isolation for thousands of years. They were built by repeated contact, repeated migration, and repeated mixing across a strait of water that never actually separated them as cleanly as the history book suggested. Entire ancestral populations existed, contributed, and then effectively disappeared from the visible record, only to resurface the moment someone finally thought to test the right bone. And the boundary between these two peoples, at the level where it actually matters, the level written into every cell of every living person descended from them, was never as solid as anyone believed. The ground beneath both national stories has shifted, not because anyone lied, but because for most of history, nobody had a way to ask the bones directly. Now that we do, they keep giving the same answer. The past was more connected, more mixed, and more surprising than either country's founding story ever allowed for. And every new genome sequenced from every newly excavated skeleton is one more small piece of evidence that the two peoples, who have spent centuries defining themselves in contrast to one another, actually share a far deeper, far more tangled, and far more genuinely human origin story than either side was ever taught to expect.